Hello and welcome to another episode of Ewell Acres. Today we're going to be doing a versus video of the best ways to go about getting bees once you've decided you want to get into beekeeping. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to another day here on the farm at Ewell Acres. So you've been looking at beekeeping, you've been doing it for a while, you've decided you want to get into it and you want to take a look at the different types of methods of how to actually get involved in beekeeping to acquire those bees. There are a couple different methods. First thing you need to look at is, do you want to buy bees or do you want to get bees for free? There are many different methods and there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those methods. So today, in looking at different methods to go ahead and get bees, we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages. However, this is going to be a condensed list for each of these methods of how to go about getting bees. For a more in-depth look, as we talk about those subjects, go ahead and click on the description in the links below as we talk about the different methods of bees and how else they're going to be a lot more effective and in depth to go about doing it, the advantages and disadvantages. So this is only going to be a cursory glance at the different methods. The first and least common method of how people go about getting bees is by getting a swarm of bees. What a swarm is a colony has survived the winter, they've grown really strong the next spring, and they've run out of room. So the old queen and a whole bunch of bees fly away looking for a new home. This typically is going to be them landing on a tree branch, a fence, or some other object that they can hang out for a couple hours on up to a couple days while they have some scout bees looking for a new home. Now, the advantages of getting a swarm is that it's very cheap. You know that it's going to be free. All you need is equipment, you're able to collect the bees, and away you go. Another advantage is you're able to break the mite cycle and continue on. The third advantage is this is a colony. Another very important advantage to take a look at is that this is a colony from the local area that's already established. It has survived the winter, it's climatized to your area, and it's a strong colony, so strong that they've been able to reproduce and go forward in creating a second colony. That's typically in the wild how bees reproduce, is by having a swarm of bees. And that's probably the most important advantage that I would say is knowing that these bees are of strong genetic stock that have been climatized to your area, at least one generation. Some of the disadvantages is you don't know what the genetic stock of the bees actually are. You don't know if they're Italians, you don't know if they're Russians, you don't know the temperament of the bees. Are they going to be a little bit more ornery, a little bit more aggressive, or are they a calm bee? It's kind of a crapshoot and you're gambling with that. You just don't know. But you really can't beat free. I would take strong climatized bees in my area and roll the dice to see if they are temperament. And if they are not kind bees, then I'll get to that point when I actually do. The next method of going about getting bees that's going to be by far the most common, at least in the North American market when it comes to bees, is what's called a package. What a package is you've got 3 to 4 pounds of bees in a wooden or plastic box with a queen, a number 110 of syrup that's been collected from a beekeeper, all thrown in. It's very easy to transport. You can ship it through the mail, on a plane, on a boat, on a bus. You can even do it in a car. It is very easy to transport, and that's why it's become by far the number one most popular way to transport and acquire bees. One of the great advantages of them is it is relatively cheap. At only $130 to $150 per package, at least in my area, it is a very viable financial option. And it's also small and transportable. You can bring it anywhere. Typically speaking, if you get it from a reputable beekeeper, you are able to know the genetics and the history of those bees. Are they Italians? Are they a local in your area? As long as they're an honest and reputable source that you're getting it from, you'll be able to get a little bit of knowledge in the background of those bees. Another advantage is because you are getting new bees and they're not on comb, you are breaking the brood cycle. With breaking the brood cycle, you are then able to cut down on the varroa mite population as well. You are having that break, and so the queen as well as the colony is able to get relief by natural means of getting those mites gone. which is a very effective and natural way of helping to cut down on varroa mite. Now, you'll still want to treat that same year, but it's definitely will help out. Some of the disadvantages that you're dealing with when you're dealing with those bees is that you may or may not get a laying queen. When you go to have that flying mating cycle, it could be rainy that day. It could potentially not get fully mated, not meet with a lot of drones, and so you may not have a well-laden queen. That is a potential disadvantage. One other disadvantage is that the colony is typically drawn in from multiple different colonies. It's not one cohesive unit, so it will take time for the bees to accept that queen. And sometimes they don't accept her and kill her. But typically speaking, that's going to be similar with many different ways of going about getting new hives. Not a big deal, but it is something to keep in mind. Another disadvantage of dealing with packages, and this is probably the number one biggest reason why I am hesitant to do packages, and if you are able to do other means, I would recommend it, is that we in the North American culture have been very, very spoiled in our ability to get packages wherever we want. I, living in the Northern Rockies in a very cold region, can have a beekeeper down in Georgia or Florida or even Southern California get bees, build up them very early, and I can have bees shipped to me in March, early April, when typically I wouldn't be able to get a package of bees until late May or even June sometimes if I were to get it in my local area, just due to the fact of how cold it is. That is a very great thing that has developed out of our modern package society, which we've been very blessed but yet spoiled with that ability to do it. However, that then means I don't necessarily have bees that have been climatized to my own personal area. I have a very cold climate, and I don't necessarily want bees that are from Georgia that are used to a very mild winter when they come over to my area, and sometimes I can get multiple feet of snow depending on where you go in the mountains. And they're not going to be used to those extreme cold temperatures, and they may not necessarily survive the winter. So if at all possible, deal with a local beekeeper that has bees that have already lived multiple generations in your area if you are going to do a package. Next method to going about getting bees in your area is doing what's called a nuke. A nuke is going to be essentially a starter hive. You have a small little box with a couple frames, deep, medium, doesn't matter. It's going to have some brood, it's going to have some honey, and it's going to be contained in a box with the bees having drawn out the comb and the queen free walking around, actively laying. The advantages of this is you can see that the queen is already actively laying. If she has good genetic stock, she's a great layer, you can go ahead and track that. It's already a small starter hive, and your bees will be able to get much further along in the season than, let's say, a package where they're going to be a little bit further behind and not as actively going. With that said, you'll still need to feed them just like any other beehive, and starting in the winter, that is always a potential. But nukes are going to help you to move much further along in that process. Some of the disadvantages, another advantage is they are almost going to be just as transportable. It's going to be fairly light. You can easily transport it and get it shipped from long distances. But typically speaking, it's going to be from another hive that's a little bit more established, and you have an older queen that's already been climatized to those bees that have already been accepted. It is going to be a much more possible of a success. It's not a guarantee, but it is going to be more likely that you have a strong colony once all is said and done. Some of the disadvantages, though, you are dealing with an established colony, which means when you go to move them around when you're first getting started, typically they're going to be a little bit more aggressive in that they have a home that they want to defend. Not a big deal, just something to keep in mind. The other thing is, nukes tend to be a little bit more expensive because they are a little bit more established. There's a little bit more investment, both time and resources, and so it will typically cost you a little bit more. In my area, you can find a nuke of bees in the $170 to $190 range as of this year in spring of 2020. So typically speaking, it can be a little bit more expensive. That's not a big deal. It is still cheaper than a fully established hive, but that is one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind when you're dealing with nukes is that you are dealing with an established hive where the queen has been actively laying, so you're not going to get a break in that brood cycle. And so, typically speaking, with nukes, you will have a higher varroa mite count that you will want to keep track of. The next hive that we're going to go ahead, or the next method that we're going to go ahead and take a look at is what's called doing a split. Now, this is essentially doing the exact same thing as a nuke, but it's a little bit different. Typically, those that do splits are going to be individual beekeepers that are going to take a strong hive and split it into 2 or 3 hives. You're going to take a natural swarming tendency that colonies have that's already strong and artificially pre-swarm it yourself, if you will, before the bees have a chance to do it themselves. This is by far the method that I would recommend. However, in order to do it, you have to have bees already established. Otherwise, a split might as well just be a nuke. The reason why I like doing a split is it's going to be off of a hive that is already established. You know what it is. You have the equipment and it is going to be free. So it is very advantageous by acquiring bees off of a split. And this is by far the number one method that most established beekeepers go about getting new colonies and expanding their colonies every year. Downside to this method, and typically is going to be the hardest, is you already have to have bees to do it. Now, is it technically a nuke? Yes, you might as well call it a nuke. But the where I draw the line is I consider a split a beekeeper that already has an established hive and making multiple colonies out of that one that he's already got, whereas a nuke is taking the bees in a box and moving it forward. So that's where kind of the definition between a split and a nuke are. Despite how very similar they are, there is that distinct difference that I think is important to consider. Now, the final way that typically most people are going to come across getting a hive is going to be purchasing a fully established hive from a beekeeper. Now, what does this entail? This entails all the equipment that you would get. Bottom board, super frames, the inner cover, top cover, the equipment as well as the bees inside of it, and the queen actively laying. This is by far the most fully established way of getting bees. You have the queen, it's already going to be in there, you're going to get the most honey and most possibility out of your first year. If it's a strong hive, you could potentially even get a split from it and have 2 hives off of that one. Are you going to get much honey out of it? Not likely, but there is that option that you could do. So the advantage is you're fully established, you're going strong, it's going to move forward. Typically, these hives are a little bit harder to manage because you don't have that learning curve that you're able to grow with the bees. So sometimes it may not be good for beginners, but it's an already established hive, so you are able to move forward with that colony without some of the potential inconsistencies that a swarm, a package, or those other methods can do. Do I personally like this method? I personally don't. There are a lot of learning opportunities that you miss in getting a brand new hive that are important when you are able to get versus a package, a split, swarm, some of those other methods. But it is by far the smallest learning curve for brand new beekeepers. That is why it's a very popular option amongst them. Some of the disadvantages when you're dealing with a brand new colony, though, is it is by far the number one most expensive way to go about getting bees. In my local area, a fully established hive is going to be in the $300 to $350 range, depending on how you're looking at. Not only are you purchasing the equipment, but there's a significant amount of time that it takes to get that going. Before I continue on with that, though, one advantage that I did forget to mention is it is a fully established hive. It's already been through the winter, so you know it's strong. Now, going back to that, the expense, there is that significant amount of time and investment from the beekeeper or whoever you're purchasing the bees from to get it going. So that is one thing to keep in mind. It is a very expensive way to go about doing it. One other disadvantage is you are not breaking the brood cycle. It's going to be having sat there, and so because of that, there's typically going to be a much higher mite population in those hives, and you're going to want to make certain to treat. When you go to move those hives, it's going to be very heavy, and there are some difficulties there. If you want to go ahead and take a look at that, go ahead and take a look at my previous video on how to move hives when talking about the fully hive more in-depth video. Now that we've talked about some of the advantages and disadvantages in dealing with some of these hives, there is the number one thing, no matter what hive you decide to do, whether you want to go free, whether you want to buy it, whether you want to buy it really expensive and get something fully established. The number one thing I need to urge everyone to do, no matter what style of hive you get, I highly encourage you to go ahead and feed. I highly encourage you to feed your bees. Liquid sugar, water, or your liquid feed, pollen patties, your brood patties, whatever you want to call them. When you're getting bees in a brand new area, whether you have established food sources or not, especially if you're dealing with colonies that don't have any food reserves whatsoever, your swarms, your nukes are going to be lower, your packages, all those types are going to be very low on feed. And when you're bringing them to a new area, they're not going to know their forage, or you could be in a dearth where you don't have as much forage available. Whether or not the bees actually take advantage of having that food source, I highly encourage you to supplement that, especially in the beginning, with those food sources, so that way the bees aren't going to starve to death. That's the number one thing that I see beginner beekeepers fail when they go to establish a brand new hive, is they think, oh, I've got a full hive, or I've got a nuke, and I don't need to go about actually feeding them. That's the number one fail that I see with nukes or with full packages, is I have an established hive, don't need feeding. Even brand new packages, when they are feeding, they don't feed them enough and don't realize just how much food the bees are going to consume to get them going. So please, I urge everyone, be responsible, help the bees live, go ahead and feed them. Now, once they're established, are they able to go off their own food sources? Awesome, go for it. Do I prefer feeding honey and then what they naturally made? Of course. If you're able to get from the natural sources, that is by far the best way to go about doing it. But if it's a choice between artificially supplementing them with a pollen patty and sugar water, or letting them die, by all means. So, now that we've gone ahead and talked about that, what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Do you prefer going free? Do you prefer purchasing? I'm always curious to learn from other people what method of beekeeping and acquiring bees they like to go about doing. Thanks for joining us as we talk about today the different methods of how to talk about in acquiring bees. If you like what we're doing, don't forget to subscribe and click on the little bell so that way you can get notified whenever we've got new posts, which we do on a regular basis. Once again, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.